Auzubillahiminash-shaytanir-rajeem. Bismillahir-Rahmanir-Rahim. Dear students, Assalamu alaikum. Our today's discussion is about Rousseau, and earlier I have explained you in two lectures Rousseau's introduction, nature of man, state of nature, and his theory of social contract. In second lecture regarding Rousseau, I have explained you about Rousseau's most famous concept and major contribution in the history of Western political thought about general will, its characteristics, limitations, and his concept of sovereignty. Our third lecture about Rousseau, I explained you his concept about liberty and rights of individuals. According to Rousseau, individual is free in the state because he does not surrender his rights to an outside authority but to corporate body of which he himself is a member. Any restrictions on the liberty of the individual are self-imposed. He further explained that obedience to law which we prescribe to ourselves is liberty. The rights of liberty, equality, and property are rights of the citizen, and in this regard, he considered that liberty is civil liberty, not natural liberty. Men are equal by law and not by nature. In actual practice, man alienates only such of his powers, goods, and liberty as it is for the community to control. But it must also be granted that the sovereign is the sole judge of what is important. Rousseau emphasizes that the end of government is not only to secure liberty for individuals but also equality, because liberty cannot exist without equality. It is very important point of Rousseau that he relates liberty with equality. In further explanation, Rousseau's theory of general will also leads to a notion of freedom in an organic life and a freedom consonant with the good of general body of the community, even though it involves a restraint. Rousseau's most important aspect is that according to him, an individual is free in following his real will. He is also free according to the general will and in obeying the laws that proceed from it, because his real will is an organic part of the general will and is in agreement with it. So, Rousseau clearly explained that it is the rational freedom of an individual who lives a common life in organic relationship with other individuals and whose welfare is integrally related to the welfare of others. An individual is free not because he can do what he wills, but because he is not subject to the will of an other individual. He is also free because instead of being a slave of his natural impulses, he enjoys moral liberty based on justice and self-imposed laws. Rousseau's views about individuals' rights and freedoms remained very important because Rousseau's sovereign is the general will composed of the real wills of the individuals who are free in so far as they follow the law of their own making. Rousseau's individual is a subject and a sovereign at a time. Rousseau reconciles individualism with absolutism and liberty with authority. Rousseau conceives of an absolute and unlimited sovereignty in terms of individual liberty, and all these aspects are very important relating to the freedom and rights of individuals in Rousseau's philosophy. Now, briefly, I explained you about Rousseau's views about law. According to Rousseau, law is an expression and the organ of the general will. A law is a resolution of, he explains, whole people for the whole people, touching a matter that concerns all. Law represents the general will with general interest in view and never has its object particular person or action. Rousseau clearly explains that nobody in this state is above the law, since everybody is a member of the sovereign body, which is the source of law. The law representing the general will, which includes the will of all, cannot be unjust because nobody is unjust to himself. One is quite free when he is subject to laws because the laws merely reflect his own will. He further highlighted importance of law, that it is law which re-established the equality which belongs to a man in the state of nature. A state is legitimate only when it is ruled by law. It is very important aspect of his philosophy that a state is legitimate only when it is ruled by law. So, law, therefore, according to Rousseau, is as sovereign as with Plato, but Rousseau puts his sovereign under the control of la volonté generated. The laws are the sole motive power of community, which acts, feels only through them. The law considers the subjects collectively and their actions in the abstract. It never has for its object an individual man or a particular action. In short, no function which refers in any way to an individual can belong to the legislative power. After examining briefly his views about law, now I explain you his views about the distinction between state and government. Rousseau, like Locke, also creates a sharp distinction between the state and the government. Thus, a state denotes the community as a whole, created by the social compact and manifesting itself in the supreme general will, whereas a government denotes merely the individual or group of individual that is designed by the community to carry into effect the sovereign will. The government is an intermediary body established between the subjects and the sovereign for their mutual correspondence charged with the execution of laws as well as with the maintenance of liberty, both civil and political. It is a subordinate agency through which the sovereign people expresses its will and realizes it. The sovereign people delegates the exercise of its sovereign power to government in the manner and to the extent that suits it at any time. So, according to Rousseau, the excellence of a government lies in property realizing general will of people, and since different people have different varieties of general will, no form of government is ideal. An individual can resist a bad government but not the state. The social contract creates not the government but the state or sovereign. The government is created by a decree of sovereign. Being a mere agent of the sovereign, a government is chargeable at the sovereign's pleasure. Having placed the government in complete subordination to the sovereign, the people who could withdraw or modify the powers assigned to the government. So, the government does not make laws which emanate from the sovereign but only administers them. Rousseau's conception of government is that of executive side of a modern democracy whose powers may be withdrawn or modified by the sovereign legislator. In this discussion, if we analyze, then we find out that Rousseau gave most importance to the sovereign state, and he considered government as a subordinate institution under the sovereign powers. During this discussion, I also briefly explain about the Rousseau's views about the origin of government. Rousseau explains that government as a distinguished body from the sovereign body. This is because he held that the sovereign regarded the subjects as a whole and that the action of the sovereign were in the nature of an abstract act. In other words, I have already explained you that government is a subordinate of sovereign body. So, the actions of the sovereign must be general and not particular. Now, the sovereign is perfectly entitled to name the form of government, such as monarchy, aristocracy, democracy, but it cannot name the officers of the governments, which will make it a particular act. The government, but not the sovereign, can do particular acts. So, the naming of the particular offices being a particular act will constitute an act of government even before the government has been institutions. Rousseau explained that sovereign people assembled to institute the government firstly vote that a certain individual shall be appointed to the officer thus created. So, Rousseau very clearly distinguishes the two acts by saying that the first vote expresses the general will and is law, while the second vote represents a mere government decree. Between the two votes, the popular assembly changes its character. In its first form, the assembly is sovereign. In its second one, it assumes the character of a democratic government. So, according to Rousseau, every form of government originates with a democracy. He further explained classification of government. Rousseau adopted the usual method like other thinkers regarding the classification of government into monarchy, aristocracy, democracy, and mixed forms of government. He believed with Montesquieu that the social, economic, and physical conditions of a country had much to do with its form of government. According to him, a democracy was one in which the sovereign assembly was the legislator as well as the administrator. He further added, however, that such a government was possible only in small areas and among small communities. His love of the democratic city states of ancient Greece and Rome, of his own native democracy of Geneva, and his theory of sovereignty being identical with the general will made democracy the best form of government with Rousseau. But democracy would not do for large communities. Rousseau did not believe that any particular form of government was absolutely the best one because he held that each form of government might be particularly suited for a particular set of conditions. A government which is good for an individual people may be bad for an other community. The same applies to whatever community is more or less politically matured or educated. He was, however, so far influenced by current economic theories as to believe that a growing population was a good index to a good government. Census was, therefore, the measure of governmental excellence. Rousseau did not conceal his dislike of a representative government. He observed about that lawmaking was the function of the sovereign, of the whole assembly of the people, and not of the government. As sovereignty was inalienable, a sovereign body could only be represented by its whole community because the general will of the sovereign community could neither be represented nor alienated. Overall, Rousseau's general will clearly represents the role of majority for the betterment of the people, and he also explained that the minority is free in following the general will. This is explained by Rousseau by saying that at the time of legislation, what is asked is not whether a particular law is or is not approved by the minority, but whether the law conforms to the general will or not. Overall, we can mention here that according to Rousseau, democracy is best form of government, and he highlighted the idea of popular sovereignty through the general will, and he clearly highlighted importance of democratic form of government. Rousseau further explained opening words of his very famous book of social contract, that man is born free but is everywhere in chains. And this opening sentence of his famous classic social contract explains that man is born free but is everywhere in chains. In the context of the general collectivism of classic, the sentence means that a man is born to be free, or that a man ought to be free, not in the licenses of an isolated and selfish individual, but in the sense of a moral citizen who participates in the general will and therefore in the making of laws which govern him. He is not actually free because all actual states are founded on force rather than on general will. So, in this point, Rousseau clearly highlighted, he clearly explained that general will is guaranteed to the peoples for their freedom, for their sovereign will, for their power of sovereignty. So, Rousseau's freedom is based on restraint arising out of self imposed rational laws. According to Rousseau, freedom is born of restraint and authority based on law arising from general will. It is to law alone that men owe justice and liberty. According to Rousseau, law forces a man to be free. A man is free under the law because such a restraint is self imposed. Besides, law dictates to each citizen the precepts of public reason and teaches him to act in accordance with the maximum of his own judgment and not in contradiction to himself. Overall, according to him, freedom of individuals protected by the society through the law, and Rousseau's concept of freedom of people, Rousseau's concept of general will, and Rousseau's concept of protection of rights, all these are closely related with each other. While concluding topic of the Rousseau, I briefly explain and repeat again his major contributions. Rousseau is more democratic than anyone else, as he clearly, comprehensively advocates for the principle of popular sovereignty. He insists that the whole body of citizens compose the legislative, and the views that the government is an instrument of the people to whom it is invariably responsible. Rousseau is indeed a democratic. The question here is whether he goes too far in his democracy, for his is essentially a totalitarian democracy. It is anti-liberal, it is reserves rights for the individuals. So, his major contribution to the Western political philosophy is his democratic ideas. Next contribution, Rousseau promoted clearly his theories, his views about individual liberty. Yet he is fearful of the consequences of that liberty. Authority must be exercised to restrain it. It is very important point that he made a balance between liberty and authority. Authority too is much authority, absolute authority without liberty also become dangerous for the society and state. So he made an arrangement to enforce the general will with the balance of liberty, and authority. His next contribution, his concept of general will. General will is Rousseau's original concept. Each free society, according to him, composed of general will through harmony and through basic aspects of society. So, his major contribution always remained in the history of Western philosophy, his contributions about the general will. Next, Rousseau supports democracy, democratic values, and next, he also promoted the ideas of direct democracy, popular democracy, and he relates direct democracy and popular democracy to his famous theory of general will. Rousseau also highlighted a distinction between government and state and also between sovereign and government or governmental institutions. Rousseau further explained his views about basic welfare, basic betterment, common good of the people through his philosophy. Rousseau also believes in extreme individualism as well as collectivism. Overall, concluding this topic, I can explain you that Rousseau always remained as a greatest thinker in the history of Western philosophy because influence on succeeding generations and succeeding philosophers and succeeding future movements can be traced out very easily. For example, in France, his ideals led to the French Revolution of 1789. In America, the theory of social contract played a very important role. It was recognized in the Declaration of Independence and the Bills of Rights in the state constitution. In England, the Bentham doctrine of greatest good of the greatest number had a close family resemblance with Rousseau's theory of general will, representing common interest of the people. So, Rousseau's philosophy provided a guideline for succeeding philosophers like Hegel, like Karl Marx, and so many other philosophers. Rousseau considered greatest philosopher because he highlighted the concept that peoples are the ultimate source of political authority. So, overall, Rousseau and his all philosophies, his views remained popular for a student of Western political philosophy, not only for the students of Western philosophy, but also in the whole history of Western political thought. So, our discussion regarding Rousseau completed, and that is the end of our today's discussion.